Hello, my name is Andrew Westover, and I'm the Key Pairing Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's roundtable conversation with curators Margot Norton, Alan and Lola Goldring Curator of the New Museum, Jamillah James, Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and Eva Respini, Barbara Lee Chief Curator of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. This program is presented in conjunction with the opening of the 2021 New Museum Triennial, Soft Water, Hard Stone, which is currently on view. The exhibition is co-curated by Margot Norton and Jamillah James. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Bowery Council, and digital initiatives are supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. I'll now share brief biographical notes about each of tonight's speakers. Jamillah James is Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. James has held curatorial positions at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, working in collaboration with Art and Practice, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Queens Museum in New York. She has curated major surveys of Nayland Blake and B. Wurtz, several thematic group exhibitions, and solo exhibitions of Lucas Blalock, Alex de Corte, Rafa Esparza, and Greene Kelly, Maryam Jafri, Simone Leigh, and Harold Mendez, among others. James is a recipient of the Curatorial Research Fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts and a Via Art Foundation Curatorial Fellowship. She has contributed to Artforum, Frieze, Art in America, the International Review of African American Art, and numerous exhibition catalogs, and regularly lectures on contemporary art, curating, and professional development for emerging artists. Margot Norton is the Alan and Lola Goldring Curator at the New Museum and is co-curator of the 2021 New Museum Triennial alongside Jamillah James. Norton joined the museum in 2011 and has worked on a number of exhibitions, curating and co-curating presentations by Carmen Argote, Judith Bernstein, Diedrich Brackens, Sarah Lucas, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, Chris O'Feely, Pippolati Rist, Mika Rottenberg, and Kari Upson, among others. In 2017, she curated the 8th Sequences Real-Time Art Festival in Reykjavik, Iceland, and the Georgian Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale with artist Anna K.E. Before she joined the New Museum in 2011, Norton worked as a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum in New York. She has contributed to and edited numerous publications and exhibition catalogs, and regularly lectures on contemporary art and curating. She holds an MA in Curatorial Studies from Columbia University. Eva Respini is the Barbara Lee Chief Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston, where she has been leading the vision of the program since 2015. Respini is organizing, with MoMA PS1, the first museum survey dedicated to the work of Dina Lawson, on view at the ICA in early November 2021. She is the co-commissioner of the United States Pavilion's historic Simone Leigh presentation for the 59th Venice Biennale in 2022. A few logistical notes before we begin. This program will last for approximately 1 hour. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there is time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming public programs on our website, newmuseum.org. Now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to Eva.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, all. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on the occasion of the opening of Soft Water, Hard Stone. And I am thrilled to be here with two formidable colleagues. Hi, Margot. Hi, Jamillah. Two curators who I deeply, deeply admire. I would say each of their curatorial work is marked by their dedication to and support of artists. And I think their work together for the Triennial stands out for its ethos of collaboration, and most crucially, for its support of the 40 artists and collectives that are featured in the new museum Triennial. So first off, I want to start with congratulations to you both, to the new museum, and to the artists. I know some of them are on with us tonight. And secondly, I want to make an admission. Like all of you, I'm here virtually. I'm speaking to you from Boston. And I have not stepped foot in the new museum to see this exhibition in person. I prepared for tonight by studying JPEGs, looking at PDFs. Margot and Jamillah were kind enough to Zoom with me to talk about the show. And this is really how we've all lived for the last 20 months. And we've all had to reimagine how to re-engage with art. And so I would posit that this triennial is very much about reimagining visual orthodoxies, social structures, our relationship to the planet and to institutions, and how structures that we once thought to be stable or fixed are in need of crucial reimagining. So with this idea of reimagining in mind, maybe we can begin with the title, which is so evocative and poetic, the title of the show, and speaks, in my mind, to the idea of reimagining change little by little. Can you tell us about the genesis for the title and what it means for the exhibition?
Sure. I'll begin. So the title of the show, Soft Water, Hard Stone, comes from a proverb that's popular in Brazil, but is also found across cultures as well. And the title informed a work by an artist in the exhibition who's based in Rio, named Gabriela Mareb. And the work is titled Machine Number 4 Stone Ground, and is included in the show as well. And I had gone on a research trip over the course of this exhibition to Brazil and met with Gabriela in her studio. And she told me about this proverb, which she translated to from the Portuguese as soft water on hard stone hits until it bores a hole. And then, we spoke a little bit about the meanings of the proverb, and she told us that it is said to have two specific meanings. The first one, which is about these ideas of perseverance and resistance and the impact that a small gesture can have in time. And then the second one, which is about ideas of impermanence and inevitable change, also transformation. And I feel like those ideas are something that we've all learned so much about in the past year and a half. However, it's important to note that that title and theme were actually in place prior to the pandemic. The studio visit was back in August 2019. So those ideas have really become only the more profound in the time since, in ways that Jamillah and I could not really have imagined.
And the title became somewhat of a scaffold for us. I remember when Margot went to Brazil and she was so excited when she got back and about this proverb and about this idea. And at the time, at that point in our research, we were beginning to see certain tendencies emerge with some of the artists, but we hadn't had quite the framework yet for the show. What we did, instead of doing a top-down approach for the show, was to allow the seeing of work, the conversations that we were having with artists really informed the direction of the exhibition. So at a certain point, when this idea of the proverb emerged, it became this very neat way of encapsulating a lot of the work that we were beginning to see and beginning to process in the research for this show.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about change and transformation, and I think I'm stating the obvious when I say that this exhibition takes place during a moment of profound change, obviously following or during a global pandemic, and also in parallel with intersecting, dramatic cultural shifts. And what's interesting to me, and you both really make a point to make this very clear, is that these themes of resistance, precarity, changeability, upheaval and instability that the show, really tackles emerged well before the pandemic. And I would say in many ways, the work and the artists you were engaging with has since become even more urgent, if that's even possible. And I'm wondering if you can just reflect on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like, as Jamillah was mentioning, when, I heard that proverb in Brazil, it seemed to encapsulate a lot of what we were kind of seeing in our research. And when we kind of approached, how we would do this research for the show, it was important to us that we not approach it with a theme already in mind, but rather let that theme emerge, from that research process. And it was really through those conversations with each and every of the artists that we visited, including the 40 artists and collectives that are in the exhibition, that these themes really came about. And so, even prior to 2020, we were certainly in this moment where we saw that a lot of work that was reflecting those ideas of, structures that we once thought to be like stable or forever, or, almost unchanging, were, also, subject to this inevitable unpredictability, and were very much on the edge of collapse. And, that was reflected in many of the works that we were seeing, not necessarily in a didactic sense, but, rather an emblematic one. And you can see that reflected, I think, in the exhibition as well. There's many works that also have these, like, porous or unstable surfaces, or works that kind of shift over time, works that destabilize that idea of like an art object being static. And also, we see these works to be catalysts in a way. A lot of them are kind of repurposing a lot of materials that are considered debris, or not considered traditional art making materials, and materials that kind of resist these simple classifications that we often apply to art making. And we see them also in a way breathing a kind of new life into collapsed constructs, and how they could take these things and reimagine them, as you described earlier.
And artists have a way of being predictive about the tensions that might arise in the world, or trends, or wanting to reimagine or experiment with materials, with ideas, with space, and with histories. And that's something that's a current that runs through the exhibition as well. I mean, many of the works that were produced for the show were produced between 2020 and 2021, but weren't explicitly about the pandemic or the global social justice protests per se, but were made in the time, in the context of this moment, and in isolation, and in a time when none of us were doing the labor in the way that we're used to doing the labor. So the traveling, the doing studio visits in person, going to art fairs, going to see art in person. So a lot of that, I think, is reflected in that. And the need for us, as we've learned in the last 18 plus months, is that the way that we work also needs to change, and artists are always adapting and experimenting in ways that perhaps curators don't always do, or institutions aren't always ready to embrace. But I think it's been a clarifying lesson for all of us, and I think the exhibition definitely embodies a lot of that spirit.
Jamillah, what you were just saying kind of evokes for me a question about process, and maybe a lot of our listeners are curious about this as well, as to how the work process and flow changed for you both once the pandemic hit and the global lockdown, was in place. And Jamillah, in the catalog, you write really beautifully about how you were going in March of 2020 home to LA for 5 days between two research trips, two ambitious, demanding research trips. And those 5 days became hundreds of days. And I know that the two of you actually, before installing the show, weren't working on this show in person since that time. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about the process of organizing this exhibition post-lockdown.
So I'll begin. Margot and I, before installation began 2.5 weeks ago, had not been in the same room since March 2020, which of course was a very emotional moment when we finally got to see each other and be in the space and begin the process of installing this show after being apart for so long. Our last trip was in late February 2020, and expanded through March 2020. We went to North Africa and Spain. And we got home, 5 days before the shutdowns. Even while we were abroad, there was a lot of conversation about, well, what is this thing? What's happening? We were in Spain, not too far from where we were. A lot of cases began to kind of filter into the news. There were, people on cruise ships that were falling ill. And, there was this gloom and this tension that was in the air. And it wasn't very palpable quite yet until I think we returned to New York, and it was during Armory Week, which was like the last semblance of normalcy that all of us saw for, the last year and a half. So once it was clear that we weren't going to be able to go anywhere and to continue the physical research that we had been doing for the past 2 years, we shifted immediately to doing Skype because Zoom wasn't really part of our vernacular at that point. Downloading Zoom and learning how to use it and figure it out, became part of our process. And oftentimes, we would go somewhere, fly, several hours away to meet with artists, and we would be having conversations over a laptop, at a cafe or, in the studio, they're showing us stuff in a portfolio. So that transition was pretty smooth, to the remote working with each other. Of course, we always want to be able to see work in person, but that wasn't possible. But conversations were, as important, if not more important, to get to the point of including someone in the show. So there was a nice continuity. It wasn't too disruptive. It was quite efficient in a lot of ways, especially once we had the theme in place and could refine our research to a point. But, even as recently as like a month ago, the pandemic still has its, imprint on this show and what we're doing. One of our artists in New Zealand, Christina Patali, couldn't get stretcher bars made because, the person that she works with, New Zealand went back into a lockdown. So, there's this constant churning of this experience that seems to have no end in sight. But at least we were able to get to this point over the past year, adapting. We had no choice.
Yeah, totally. It's also, this show has been going on for 3 years. So like we had a year and a half of really intense physical research. We had I think like a trip a month. we were doing a lot physically, before, it kind of changed completely in halfway through the process. So and I do think that year and a half too was really invaluable, like going to a lot of places where it really made a difference to be there, and to do research in places that perhaps artists don't have like as much web presence or a certain structure built in. So that was also important. And then of course, like after we had the theme, it was much more efficient, I think, to conduct visits all over the world, in a single day. We were doing, 6 to 8 visits with artists. It was, also, very, very high pace.
Well, it's quite a feat, because I think this triennial is, and what I admire about this triennial is how you've really made a commitment to making visible the practice of artists who may not have otherwise had received major exposure. You focused your research on areas that are often represented in international exhibitions, and it's extremely global in its reach. And I think the majority of the artists are exhibiting their works in a US museum for the first time with this triennial. So can you talk about that a little bit and how you sort of forefronted that in your process?
Sure. I think like the Triennial is a really unique platform because it's just such an incredible opportunity to, devote an exhibition like this to the work of emerging artists and from all over the world that, the majority of which are really, showing their work here for the first time. And even before I started working at the New Museum, I was always struck, in New Museum Triennials about, how many artists I was not familiar with, or who maybe are more well known in their local context but haven't had international exposure. And so it's an incredible honor and opportunity to actually be able to do that research and travel and to kind of dig deep into practices that haven't really had as much exposure, and to get to present their work in this platform for sure. But yeah, when kind of deciding, when Jamillah and I had our first meetings and we're deciding on like where we wanted to go or what we wanted to focus on, it was important to us that we, think about what I was mentioning earlier, about where it really made a difference to be there, not just places that are like often visited on this global art circuit or where they have, major international exhibitions or art fairs, but others that really don't have as much of that infrastructure, or where other triennial curators didn't have the chance to travel to. We kind of, in addition to doing international travel, we were also thinking about how, with the Triennial, it's it's known for its international reach, but there's also some areas that are almost close by that don't often get the chance to have artists in these kind of exhibitions. So we did do a lot of research, locally as well, in Canada and in North America. And there's artists in the exhibition too in cities. Me being in New York and Jamillah being in LA. Besides these two cities, like where could we go where we, where artists are making incredible work. So yeah, we have artists from all over the U.S. and in a lot of other cities as well.
Yeah, it was critically important for us. We're both curators that live on opposite coasts, to not just hyper focus on New York and Los Angeles, which are considered, the art capitals of this country, and sometimes, outside of this country. And, a lot of the fun of this exhibition was meeting with artists who are living and working in cities across the country that have very vibrant artist communities and institutions. Portland, Oregon, Baltimore, Maryland, where I lived for a number of years and really cut my teeth as a curator, St. Louis, Fall River, Massachusetts, Atlanta, Georgia, and so many other cities throughout North America, that, there are these great artists that are working there that deserve to have the platform that this exhibition can provide, and also to be contextualized alongside, artists working internationally, and recognizing that there are a lot of commonalities between these practices, and understanding that, as much influence as New York and Los Angeles continue to have, they're not necessarily the center of this field anymore. And I think this exhibition really illustrates that.
So I do want to get to the artists and artworks in a moment, but I have one question or one comment about the catalog, in that you really make a point in the exhibition catalog to forefront artists' voices. I believe every artist is interviewed, and so their voice is sort of, given a platform that typically in a show of this scale, a group show of this scale, they may not have. And the interlocutors or the interviewers, conducting these interviews are artists, art historians, curators. And so for me, this is so indicative of this ethos of collaboration and ethos of citation that I think is important to you both and permeates the whole project. And I'd like to just hear more from you about the thinking behind this, because it's certainly a lot of work to do all of that.
Yes. Usually in an exhibition publication, you only hear from the curators, or you hear from people that the curators have commissioned. And there's, the standard artist entry that's written about the participating artists. And, we wanted to approach this publication differently, and rather than have artist entries that often feel a bit removed or have some distance, we wanted to get up close and personal with the artists and have an opportunity for their voices to be heard. You hear the voice of the artist through the objects that are on view, but to actually hear directly from them. And, for many, it's their first occasion to have a substantial interview for a publication. So it's a good opportunity to provide some grounding for their work or their concerns from their own perspective, and to also acknowledge the network of people that helped make this exhibition possible, and were collaborators with us and co-conspirators with us to make this exhibition and publication possible. So there are a number of colleagues that are in this publication that interviewed certain artists that they may have recommended to us, or they've already been in conversation with these artists, or fellow artists reflecting with the artists in the exhibition.
Yeah, I just wanted to also give a shout out to, Pacific, who designed this beautiful book. No, they did an amazing job. And, also our curatorial fellows, Jeanette Bishops and Bernardo Mascara, who also wrote an essay for the catalog. And yeah, it really takes a village to do these shows. And I think that was also, a part of it too, is that, it's not just us like that are imposing our ideas on this work. But I also often find that whenever I do read a book, I go directly to the interview, because that's the source, hearing from the artist directly. And rather than imposing our thoughts on the work, it's really these collaborations and these dialogues with our colleagues around the world that inform this exhibition.
So maybe now's a good moment to kind of segue to talk a little bit more about some of the works and the themes. I will state again that I have not seen this show in person, but one thing that I'm really struck by is the kind of proliferation of sculpture and sculpture with found material, that there's a materiality that seems to be pretty prevalent in a lot of the work. And, in a moment when we're all experiencing so much of the world virtually, I'm really hungry to engage with materiality, tactility with objects. But certainly there is so much more at play than just that, this idea of kind of what these works are talking about in terms of the precarity of the planet, of our social structures, our bodies, that these themes seem to undergird these very tactile works. And I know that you've organized some of the organizing principles of the show, also sort of follow the architecture of the museum. And I wonder if maybe you can kind of open by talking about how you've sort of organized that for the viewer as they go through the museum.
Sure. Yeah, I think, definitely there's a lot of material exploration in the show, a lot of tactility. Yeah, I feel that, it's almost an antidote in a way to how much time we're spending with screens. A lot of the works do demand a slower pace and a deeper engagement. And yeah, I dearly hope that people will be able to come and see the show in person. And, I think that, I can talk a little bit about how we structured the show. When we were designing the exhibition in the physical space, we decided to kind of break it up into these sub-themes. It's certainly a group exhibition, but we were kind of thinking about these themes that, ran throughout different artist practices that evolved kind of across the floors of the museum. The museum's kind of arranged almost like a layer cake, with these different floors. And we were thinking about them, each having a very distinct feeling. So I guess I can run through a little bit about, starting with the fourth floor, which these are images of the fourth floor that you see here. So the fourth floor is kind of the brightest floor. We've allowed a lot of natural light on this floor. We opened the skylights and the windows, and we also wanted to allow that to inform the works and for them to shift actually throughout the course of the day. And so many of the works on this floor are about this like regenerative potential of the natural world, and our inseparable relationship to it too. A lot of works that are addressing kind of longer and slower timescales, engaging with history and historical traumas, acknowledging them, but also recognizing adaptability and certainly that of nature and this ability to persist.
And sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You're seeing images now. We're moving through the third floor, which, when you descend the staircase from the fourth floor into the third floor, use the elevator to enter into the third floor. It does have a distinctly different feel. The fourth floor is very open and bright and airy, and there's a lot of organic materials that the artists are using to make their work. And then when you enter into the third floor, there is this, kind of harder edge to the works that are on view. There's a use of industrial materials and stable materials like the work of Lori Kang or Jay Fan. There's also this negotiation of class, labor, race, gender, things that kind of govern and inform the lived experience or the movement of bodies through social space and physical space. Something that we realized, in talking about the show and seeing it take shape in the building is that there's not a lot of representational work in the show. A lot of it is implied, or the videos that are in the exhibition, there are 3 videos that are on this floor, really do the heavy lifting of, talking about visibility or protest or a whole host of other things. But the body is never really as present on that floor, except for in the videos.
And yeah, there's certainly also on this floor a lot of artists. Like we were thinking a lot about this idea of like the body and also industry. And so there's a lot of these like kind of combinations between, the corporeal, but also, the industrial materials and kind of this relationship between the body and architecture, or how the environments that we create kind of inform ourselves and vice versa. And there's this almost reciprocal kind of relationship between the two. And, a lot of the works also are addressing ideas of like gentrification and displacement, and this kind of interdependent relationship between our bodies and our environments. And then, moving down on the second floor, and I guess the images will catch up with us. Here we are.
There we go.
On the second floor, we see a lot of artists that are engaging with like radical experimentation, I think, with materials and using a lot of non-traditional materials, as well as questioning ideas of hierarchy and value in museum contexts. A lot of artists are like repurposing and upcycling kind of everyday debris and transforming them into something else entirely. A lot of works that appear, almost vulnerable in their kind of changeable state, but yet they also have this monumentality in their kind of feeling or their scale. And here we also see a lot of artists engaging with kind of entrenched legacies of colonialism and displacement and violence even, and but yet I feel like even when engaging with this darker subject matter, there's a hopefulness in many of these works too. They don't ignore the problems of the past, and they deeply engage with them, but also reflect ideas of resilience and strength, and in some cases even a haunting.
Yeah, I think the way that we've characterized this floor is maybe the most straightforward museological display. I mean, in this room, we have Evgeny Tubier, which is the image that we see, who's using kind of the language of museum display, but kind of turning it on its head, or Rose Solane, who, has been using rings that she's found or purchased or collected, and assigning different layers of value to them, but also recognizing the importance of personal value that is assigned to objects that, is often left to the wayside when thinking about something in a museum context. And there's also like a lot of video on this floor as well. Amelie Smith, Gail Schwann has this large installation and Taowen fan. There is this rich materiality that I think really comes to the fore on this floor, and really showing artists experimenting with non-traditional materials and really just flipping on head historical tropes, ways of approaching materials, ways of producing art, and art history in the canon as well.
And I also wanted to mention some works that are kind of throughout the museum. I feel like there's this way that a lot of the works kind of, play with the architecture or like push against the architecture in some way. We, also have kind of in these interstitial spaces, like in the stairwell between the 3rd and 4th floors, these machines by Gabriela Mereb that are like consistently whirring and spinning, and also these like more subtle interventions by a Tunisian artist named Alex Zayed, which are these tiny little elements that he collects in his journeys that are kind of displayed throughout the museum. And there's also this fantastic work by Janine Frey-Najutli, which is called Fighting for the Title Not to Be Pending, which are these tiny little beads, which are actually the artist's body weight in beads, which are in all of the kind of cracks and corners and crevices of the museum. And we even put some on the sidewalk outside the museum as well, which are, again, like dealing with, what Jamillah was speaking about a lot about this like refusal of representation, because it is the artist's body, but it's also, not represented in a traditional way, but kind of throughout the museum, and all of these, corners that are often overlooked, and we might even, step on top of them and not realize, and how they kind of deal with the way that, these bodies and these histories and these cultures are also kind of embedded within the kind of grounds that we walk upon.
And there's also on the facade of the building a work by Samara Scott, which offers an opportunity for the passerby to have this interaction with an artwork, whether or not they come inside the museum. We hope that they do, but recognizing that people are at different places with their orientation to museums as an entity. But it's a fantastic opportunity for people to see an artwork, and it's a really great activation of that space as well. So we really want to use every corner of this building. Why not?
every crack and every corner. It's amazing. I can't wait to see it. It struck me as you were both talking how much you use sort of certain words in terms of things that really push against an orthodoxy of museum display, of how institutions categorize things, how how architecture usually is used, or how it functions within the context of a museological display. As curators, we have the impulse to create clarity, to put things into categories, to bring a certain kind of rigor. And yet here are artists whose work have resisted all kinds of categorization and really are pushing against these sort of orthodoxies. And so I wondered, as curators, how do you on one hand bring clarity, right? How do you kind of bring these works to audiences in a way that creates threads and conversations and themes that are clear, but on the other hand, how do you honor chaos and resistance?
I love this question.
Yeah.
because it is like, I mean, this is what this platform provides, right? Yeah, we're in a museum, so we're engaging with that. It's what we're pushing up against in this. It's part of how this context, is, I think, also very inspiring. I mean, for example, like Samara's work, which Jamillah was describing, which is on the facade. It's most certainly a painting, but there are no painting materials in the work. Or Nadia Bellarique, who's on the fourth floor, who's engaging with so many kind of principles in photography. This is the piece with those barrels, and each one is a kind of portal, and has a lot of like kind of found objects through these stained glass lenses, and kind of are meant to be looked at and through. And with a work like that too, it's like it's engaging with photography, but it's most certainly a sculpture, but it's also a wall. I mean, I think these things are also something that we're struck by with all of these works, that they are not kind of reinserting these traditional contexts, but they are reimagining them or questioning them, but also kind of taking them one step further.
And artists and likewise curators of this generation have embraced this, critical, this desire to be critical of the institutions that we know of, the histories that we've received. And we've really embraced an interdisciplinary approach to reduction, or skeptical or desiring of new readings or new models to do the work that we do. Collaboration is important. Using unorthodox materials provides new directions. I think a lot of this, this is just like kind of a side ancillary thought, but, some of this idea of like chaos and resistance kind of coexisting in the same space, or these dualities that, coexist. It could be a lot of the fact that, a lot of the artists in the show, us as curators born after 1980, we've grown up, in the information age, where we're consuming a lot of information, recycling a lot of things, taking, indiscriminate sources of materials and influences and kind of repackaging them, representing them, and have this real embrace for indirect answers or untidy resolutions as a common practice. As curators, it's our job to provide some kind of framework, to provide a container or a space and to do the interpretive work. But it's also, an opportunity for us to kind of stand back and let artists flex that muscle to do that kind of creative chaos that they sometimes can do, and work together to continue to spill across the borders of orthodoxy, because we want to do the same thing that's been done for 100 years. We have an opportunity to do something different.
Jamillah, you brought up the notion of generation, and that most of the artists in the show are born in the 1980s. I think it's between 75 and 93 are those birth years of the artists. So in a way, you can think of this as defining a generation, which is also your generation. And so I wondered if this was a conscious decision, and whether you can talk a little bit more, you started to talk about this, about what it means to create a show that might define a generation. And that ethos of that generation.
Yeah, when preparing for this exhibition, I looked back at previous triennials or shows of this nature, where there is this desire to present this idea of emerging category or emerging artists, and recognizing that people are at different places in their lives. And the same can be said about age as a category. And when we started the process for the show, we were less interested in, these kind of artificial categories of age as a determinant of, an emerging practice or an emerging artist, and really just wanting to give as much latitude as possible to recognize that people sometimes enter into being artists at a different stage in their life, or a later stage in their life. So, with this show, the artist that's the oldest in the show was born in 1975. The artist that was the youngest in the show was born in 1993. There is an 18-year span there. And we've all lived and kind of experienced the same set of issues or histories. Even though we might be in different places in the world, there's always this constant churn of activity that can be repeated across cultures or across geographies. I think we wanted to be a bit loose about how we approach the organizing of this show and not adhering too strictly to the idea of age. And it's hard to demarcate a generation. I mean, the first New Museum Triennial was called, everyone knows it as Younger Than Jesus, but it was also called the New Museum Generational, which that language is kind of, we've moved away from that language a bit and talking about the show or as a subtitle for the show. But I think if you're thinking about a set of artists that are living at a particular time, and that includes us as curators who were born, I was born in 1980, these are artists that are making art at this time. Even if they're reflecting on other histories, they're living and working in this time, and there's this shared experience, even though there might be a lot of differences along the way.
And, of course, it's also, these artists are emerging more in terms of exposure, perhaps, than, in terms of age. It was important for us that, they not have had, major institutional, attention or within these kind of frameworks that the exhibition provides. And so we were thinking a lot about that, but also, people do, it wasn't like we were looking at artists who've been making work for 30 years or who had, a kind of larger body of work under their belts, but ones that were kind of coming into their practice and at a certain moment, whether they had done that, right out of school or not.
So I want to go back and just tease out a couple more of the themes that you all talked about, but I do want to encourage everyone who's on with us, if you want to type a question in the chat, feel free to do so. We're monitoring and we'd be happy to, bring that forward. But, this idea of materials that dissolve, decay, transmute, or fade away. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that because it seems to be present in quite a few of the works, but also this kind of challenge to, the very notion, I think you talked about this, value of definitiveness or fixedness, if that's a word. If you can just talk a little bit more about that as a theme and those artworks in particular.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. There's some really beautiful projects that are going to kind of shift throughout the course of the show. For example, like the work that gives the exhibition its title, it's about this machine that's like consistently, hitting the stone to bore a hole in it and perhaps alter its weight and cause it to topple over. This is the image of it here on the right. We'll see how far it gets. Somebody mentioned at the opening that perhaps the stone might outlive the machine, but we never know. It's kind of consistently churning, throughout the course of the show. And then other works. Jay Fan's work is a really good example of this. Jay is a artist kind of based between Brooklyn and Hong Kong, who's created this piece that is an interconnected lattice of these glass tubes that are kind of covered in silicone. This is a piece that's on the third floor of the museum. And within this structure, they've inserted a live liquid culture, which is spores of a kind of black mold that asexually reproduces within. It's kind of an environment for it to thrive in a way. So throughout the course of the exhibition, this mold will kind of continuously transform and kind of get darker and larger throughout these tubes. That's an example of one of the works that will shift. Lori Kong is another artist that has created this wall that divides the exhibition space on the third floor. It was also important for us to engage with the museum architecture in that way and to have a lot of artworks that would kind of divide the exhibition space or act as walls that would, that viewers could kind of go throughout and kind of against those standard walls that we often see in museums. And with that piece, she's created this, I think it's 25 feet long wall using, your typical aluminum studs that are used to create a wall, but also this kind of flexible stud structure that kind of comes out almost like the guts of the walls are all around it. And then on that wall are these unfixed photographs, which she originally put up in her studio windows, and then the light of the window would create the image on the photograph. And then they are unfixed. So throughout the course of the exhibition, they will the color will continuously change. So yeah, those are just some examples of some of the artworks that are kind of engaging with time in that way, slowly but surely.
And I also want to point to Janine Freyna-Julie's work with the beads fighting for the title not to be pending after, in the life of an object after an exhibition or after it leaves a studio. Once the show closes, we have to return the beads to Janine. This is only the second time, I believe, that this work has been staged. So we have to, vacuum up everything, maybe even the beads on the Bowery, and return it to the artist. And every single time that the work is presented, there'll be fewer and fewer beads. So it's a constantly changing work. I don't know if the artist will intend to show this work, once there's not a high quantity of beads left, but that is a possibility with this work. So they're not just changing, the work isn't just changing, by virtue of being on site, but it also will have a different life after it leaves the museum. So this show will continue to impact the life of that object.
It's a beautiful idea to think about that afterlife of that piece and how it will continue. I'm curious to talk a little, or to hear you all talk a little bit more about the idea of archives and sort of acts of recuperation. There seem to be a few works that speak to that idea, and also sort of related politics of visibility and social space. I'm wondering if you could tease that out a little bit more.
Sure. There's a couple of works that are on the fourth floor that engage directly with some of these ideas. Kang-Sung Lee, who's one of the artists in the show from Los Angeles, has this body of work called Garden, where he's looking at these queer legacies that are overlapping, even though people might be from different spaces or different points in their lives, but they're joined in some way. For a number of years, Kang has been visiting the Garden Prospect Cottage, which was a place where Derek Jarman lived and maintained a garden, and collecting pebbles and organic elements from that to incorporate in this work. There's two large format drawings in the show, that one of which is a pebble from Derek Jarman's garden, who's a British filmmaker who's highly influential, part of the queer new wave, and also became a very active AIDS activist, after his diagnosis. And combining that idea and that legacy with the work of a Korean activist named Oh Jun-soo, who was highly vocal about the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Korea at a time when there was no conversation about that, and bringing these two people into conversation with each other through this collection of organic materials. So Kang has incorporated materials from Taphole Park in Seoul, which is a queer cruising site and social space, and bringing these two histories into conversation with each other and creating this informal archive. There's also another work that Kang has done for the show, which is called Archive in Dirt, which is a cactus that is propagated from a clipping from a cactus that was found in the apartment of Harvey Milk, who's become an iconic figure in LGBTQ history. And this plant continues to live and embody, connects to this history, but also is like a physical object that was touched and in conversation and living in the space of a person that's become a major influence. So, there are these different types of archives that are coexisting that are a part of his work and are one of a couple of instances in the show.
As we're talking to each other, through screens, I was also struck by, and you talked about this a little bit, by how much of the work in the show is about this idea of sort of hybridity or fluid boundaries between things, the natural world, non-human entities, and how that reflects or, engages our own bodies. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of those artworks that are sort of thinking or exploring those ideas.
The first one that really comes to mind for me is Amelie Smith's film Clay Theory, which is a 3D film that's included in the exhibition, which actually looks at very explicitly at this idea of the connections between humans and the earth. So the title Clay Theory is borrowed from a chemist, Graham Crunsmith's theory that life on Earth actually originated with clay that may have acted as a precursor to, our bodies, or to human material. And the film actually focuses on a group of terracotta figures from Cyprus, from the Bronze Age, that were once thought to have been alive. And she speaks to a geologist and an archaeologist and an art historian, and kind of about these relationships between the human body and clay, and this plausibility that those figures might have been precursors to artificial life in some way. And then, there's other works in the exhibition that really do engage your body. I mean, even this work by Amy Land and Enzo Camacho, that was just on screen, is a great example of that. As you kind of go throughout the space, you hear these sounds, and a lot of them are almost like these bodily sounds, or these sounds from within. Certainly Kate Cooper's piece, which is a new film that she created for the exhibition that is interested in stimming and these sounds that actually produce a very intense sensory response in the bodies of the viewers. And yeah, there's also, there's so many works in the exhibition that are addressing these ideas of fluid boundaries and, this kind of inseparable separation between the earth and ourselves. And, I think about Brendan and Dife's pieces on the fourth floor, which are these, they look like these trees that are kind of taking over these domestic furniture items, or, Erin Jane Nelson, who is also creating these, very kind of hybrid, almost like amoebic forms out of clay, out of ceramics. And even Amber Wellman's painting, which is, very much about these kind of fluid boundaries between bodies, engaging in, these kind of erotic scenes and, fleeting movements, and are not really captured or contained or representing like a full body, but certainly, more of this idea of the body in motion, or these reciprocal relationships between beings.
Yeah. And also Sandra Njideka, whose video Pervasive Light is near Ambera's painting, where there's this engagement with visibility and blackness, and there's a figure that's moving in and out of frame in the 3 screens that comprise the work, and they're never fully able to be seen or captured because they're constantly on the move and evading the gaze of the viewer.
So our colleagues behind the scenes have stopped the slideshow as a way maybe to signal for us to maybe wrap it up, and we are getting close to the hour. Maybe a last question that we could end on is, Jamillah, you end your essay with a description that the works of these artists are 40 propositions. I like that. They're propositions on how to live in the present moment while shifting through the debris of the past. And I would say you end on an optimistic note. That's how I might characterize it. And I wondered if, well, number one, if my characterization of optimism is correct, or if you see it that way, and how coming out of these past 2 years, past 3 years, whether these artists might be giving us signposts or guideposts to how we navigate our times.
Yeah, admittedly, the essay was very difficult to write because there isn't this distance from this moment. We're still living in the midst of this, and this is still very much our context. And my hope is that we'll be able to look back at this moment with some distance at some point and be able to recognize that some of this present, well, hopefully not this present will be in that present, but that there will be this conversation. Artists are always our guides with navigating the world around us, and we as curators collaborate with them, but we often follow their lead. The essay does end on an optimistic note, even in spite of everything that's happened and like the catastrophic, losses that we've endured over the last 2 years, that there is this opportunity to, be together again, to be able to see art again and to be inspired and to learn things and to teach as well. So, I do think that artists often are the guides and often are predictive of so many things. And with this exhibition, these works, there's a lot that they're conjuring, a lot that they're bringing to the fore, and they are 40 different directions of thinking about this present. There's no one way to be in this moment. And I think, the essay, I think, points to some of the hope of continuing to, live as discursively, and to continue to keep moving forward together as a people, but also, with some hope. We have to posit a future, even if it seems that our present is really difficult and formidable to deal with.
I also just want to add that I feel that these events of the, past year and a half and the pandemic, but, also this like need for cultural shifts is, it's incredibly important to kind of reassess these relationships, right? These structures that we kind of unthinkingly follow. And, and also to acknowledge that they are not forever, and I feel like these works, they, like, Jamillah was explaining, like there are guides, but yeah, they have this prescience. These artists are like the first to kind of pick up on these tremors before they become something bigger. Yeah, it's been just such an honor and a privilege to have this opportunity to pay close attention to them and to follow their lead.
Yeah, canaries in the coal mine, maybe. We do have a question in the chat from Natalie Bell. Thank you, Natalie. And the question is about what seems to be a lack of, or not a lot of, traditional painting in the show. And just wondering if you all could speak to whether that's because fewer artists are using painting to mark changes in material or form over time in a way that felt relevant to your concept.
We looked at a lot of painting. In the span of our research for this show, we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of artists, and it was a happy accident that the majority of the show is sculpture, which of course is, a challenge because you have finite amount of floor space and a lot of wall space. So, with the painters that are in the exhibition, they are really holding their own. And Barra Wellman's painting is 30 feet. It's the biggest painting that she's done. It's the biggest painting that has been on view at this museum. Yeah. But it's an opportunity, but, as Margot said earlier, Samara Scott is also painting. It's not in an orthodox way. She's using hair gel, fabric softener, cigarette butts, detritus, all kinds of things to make this, work on the surface, on the facade of the museum. So I think, there are opportunities to think about a lot of the works in dialogue with painting, whether or not they are actually physically painting. I think there's like 5 painters in the exhibition. There's also no traditional photography in the exhibition as well, but Nadia Bellarique and Lori Kang are also very much engaged in photography and are working in the cameraless mode of photography. So, we took this as an opportunity to really embrace artists that are experimenting with these forms and pushing boundaries and, creating new sets of ideas and new sets of parameters of what these mediums can be.
Yeah, that was certainly very important to us. And yeah, you can also notice that, of the paintings in the exhibition, none are figurative. Yeah, we were definitely, thinking about that, like, and yeah, these like ways of, perhaps like refusing these, traditional methods or even trends, and, ways of kind of pushing these materials forward. I mean, even like Christina Patali's paintings are, on drop cloths, and they're using house paint, and they're, engaging with, the way that she came into painting, through, her family's work in house painting, or, even with, Cynthia Deno's, paintings As I Lay Dying, which are like a serial type of painting. I think, we were, when we were, engaging in traditional modes of art making, we were thinking about how these are kind of pushing or, extending the possibilities of those modes.
Yeah, and it seems like you've done that all across the show, right? I mean, as you kind of both posited, we could have asked that same question about photography too, right? About traditional photography and perhaps the seeming lack of it in the show. So I think, it's really admirable how you have given platform to artists who really are challenging us in so many different ways. And I just want to take the moment to congratulate and thank you all once again for sharing your process. And I cannot wait to see this show. For those of you who can go to New York in person, I think it's open through the end of January 23rd. So lots of time to see it. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Eva.
Thank you so much, Eva. And thank you, everyone. Come see the show. Congrats to the artists.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.
You too.